sitting back there for a while, and then moved to Westchester in high school. I was always interested in history and Spanish. And then I actually got more interested in Spanish when I had nothing to do one summer, and my mom was going to study Spanish in Mexico. So I went down with her and lived with a Mexican family for a few weeks. And from there, I realized that I really loved Latin America and Spanish. And then I went into business because actually when I got out of school, I thought it would be, to be honest, I thought you probably don't make any money in politics. And it's a hard road, and so I would try business, which I thought I would hate, and then and then I would wipe that out of the list of things to think about and then go on and do politics. But I tried business, and I thought it was actually really interesting. I'm not at all a numbers person, so I work on Wall Street, but I'm fine with numbers. I deal with them in the context of selling products or forecasting how much money our firm will make, but I'm not sitting there with a spreadsheet every day. So I decided I wanted to mix finance and Latin America, so I got my degree in Latin American Studies, and then I went over to Brown Brothers and went up through MSCI. So what MSCI does is we're down at 7 World Trade Center, and we basically, the way to think about it is when someone says how is the U.S. economy doing, a lot of times they're just talking about how the stocks on the stock exchange are doing. And in the U.S., a lot of people talk about the Dow Jones or the S&P 500 as the indexes. MSCI creates the indexes for the rest of the world. So we're always, if there's a mutual fund, it has to see how it's doing, they look at it versus an MSCI index. So we're creating those indexes for all over the world, and then having products traded off of them.
So our first question is, we said in your bio that you worked on the Europe and Asia team. So how were your experiences working for these teams, different in terms of being a woman in a powerful position and kind of like the cultural barriers that may have or may have not been present as a result of working with like international?
Yeah, so this was a long time ago, so I was in my early 20s, so I probably wasn't a woman of power at that point. I was just out of school, but I did have a role where I represented what foreign investors' view of these countries were. So I will, it was probably some of the most important things that I learned from the experience were, going to Asia. I had to learn all about, I'd never studied Asian culture, and so going in as a woman, I had to make sure I wasn't making some big mistakes. I was already a young woman. In some countries in Asia, that was no problem. There were plenty of women in business. In other countries in Asia, there were essentially none. And so I learned about the culture and made sure I gave business cards with 2 hands. In the U.S., what we do is we take them and stick them in our back pocket, which is like the utter offense in Asia, right? Because you're basically sitting on someone's card, which represents them, right? So we had to learn to take the business cards and act appropriately. There are definitely some funny stories. I remember telling my sister, but in those days, we were able to fly first class. Now the companies are all more careful about that, but I was flying between 2 Asian countries. I was the only woman in first class, and I had changed into my casual clothes, so they thought I was a child. And they offered me lots of chocolate chip cookies and orange juice on my trip, and someone actually asked me where my parents were. So, and that was on a business trip. And I think that actually they hadn't seen women fly in that particular group. Hadn't seen women fly in first class before. So, but overall, I felt that actually everyone was, the Asia trips were good. I went once every 3 months for 2 weeks. We went to every country for 2 days, and we were able to be honest, we found people very accommodating in terms of listening to the message we were bringing about foreign investor views of those countries. In Europe, I have to admit that one of the things I remember most is being jealous that women were allowed to wear skirts without stockings. When I worked at Brown Brothers, this is going to date me. I think I'm 100 years old, but really Brown Brothers I think was a little behind their times. But when I started at Brown Brothers, we were not allowed to wear pants. It was in Boston. It was in the winter, and it was freezing. And when I left Brown Brothers, I will tell you that I walked out of there in pants, but that was a violation of policy when I did do it. But I would say that I think mostly that if you have an experience, or for me, I felt if I had an experience to work or live overseas, that's an invaluable experience. And so you give up a lot. Work-life balance is very difficult. Asia was hard. If we went away for, essentially we would go away for a week plus both weekends, and you get back and essentially something like a third to a half of the month was gone. In your early 20s, your friends all came back, they all had different boyfriends and girlfriends. The world had totally changed in your view. But the experience was an incredible experience, and you just learned so much about what you want to do. So going to both Europe and Asia taught me that what I loved about Latin America, actually, in terms of financial markets, is similar across many other markets of the world, which is that they're changing a lot. I found, to be honest, the U.S. kind of financial markets were boring to me here in the U.S. because, they were more like steady and stable, where around the world, which actually, by the way, turns out not to be true, right? They go up and down plenty. But at that time, I hadn't realized that the Asian markets and European markets would be as exciting as I thought Latin America was. So new experiences taught me a lot.
And how were you able to work your way up to becoming a managing director of the MSCI Index? And how do you think your gender may have affected your rise in the workplace and the attitude and the direction as you kind of made your way up in your career?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think one of the things that was most important is being confident, because in the area of finance that I'm in, where I don't crunch numbers all day, there's a big part of my business which is relates to risk management, and there's some highly quantitative models. So it's a very common meeting for me to go into a big room with, actually it's kind of interesting, most of the men, a lot of men are Indian men, and so that's a common meeting for me to go into a room full of Indian men, or a mix. But actually, I'll say a lot of Indian men have done well in finance in the U.S., so that's a common meeting. And so I think it's just a very important factor has been in comfort level and speaking in meetings. So we do our women's leadership events at my company. I started a women's leadership forum there. And it's quite interesting because what we talk about at that level is the discussion of women taking a seat at the table. So it's common for women to not feel comfortable coming up and literally sitting at the table. So we have to encourage our female colleagues to do that. If there's an empty seat next to our CEO, the head of our company, I usually take that seat. But we find that it's helpful to encourage other women to take that seat. So one is figuratively, people say take a seat at the table, but actually literally doing that. And then also saying what you think, just having a voice. And by doing that, you share your opinions and people understand that you have value to add. I will make one comment about that we also discuss a lot in the women's leadership discussions at my company and outside, is that I have been characterized by my boss previously as being aggressive. And so we kind of joke a bit or talk about how women in business who are progressing their careers are called aggressive. The funny part is when I was told that, I thought it was a compliment. So I was a salesperson, and I was like, oh, great. And then I only realized a bunch of years later that maybe that was a bit of a mix, right? Like aggressive, but too aggressive, right? So I think it's very important to have your voice be heard. I do think there's a chance you'll be called aggressive. I don't think it matters. I think, women should have their voice heard. If someone calls you aggressive, that's fine. A lot of men I deal with are aggressive as well. And so just making sure you share your views actually allows you to progress your career nicely, I think.
Yeah, and I'm also kind of curious. So I think that in America, especially, like a lot of young people want to be in the business sector and they want to kind of have a job like yours. And what do you think is the best way to get girls kind of not so discouraged about going into such kind of a masculine field? And is it at the primary level? Is it the secondary level? Where do we start and how can we go from there?
That's a great question. I think it's probably groups like this. To be honest, that's what I see. I think we started women's leadership forums at my company, and then an industry-wide one, and then you start girls groups in high school, and to be honest, we're all here to help each other. So we start to link the groups. I mean, I think there's way more than that. So I'm more dealing with what is in my spectrum of thinking. So I'm sure there's a lot about education. We could probably talk way more to this about education. But actually in a more practical level in terms of what we do, we have the women's in our women's leadership organization essentially can choose how they want to structure it, right? So I said, I'm interested because my niece goes to high school. I'm interested in linking with high schools, and my other niece in Sacramento goes to high school, and she's gotten involved in our this year we rang the opening bell on the New York Stock Exchange to celebrate International Women's Day, right? So how much bigger can we make that, and how much awareness can we bring? You know, maybe we can have high school students there next year. So I think that's probably a whole lot more, but one